Assalamu alaikum. Nangan Def. There you go. Nakawaka. Sayram Jam. Yes, Jamrek. Peace alone. Alhamdulillah. Thank you, friends. So, and thank you for coming back for day 2, for the second day, where we will focus on the second part of our theme, Hope for the Earth Community. And I want to start this morning with thinking about creation narratives. Do you know, either in your culture or other cultures that you've worked with, their creation stories, different creation narratives, right? The Fulani people, who are the Pular speakers, the semi-nomadic people in West Africa, in the Sahel, at the base of the Sahara Desert. These are people that you may have heard, particularly in Nigeria, that there's conflict between the pastoralists and the agriculturalists. The pastoralists are the Fulani people. And they're well established in Senegal, where we were serving, and there was a group there that the ELCA started years ago to work with in order to increase the milk production of their cattle. In the face of desertification, milk production was down, and when we can't feed our babies, that's when conflict arises. And so we started a milk project that is booming now, cross-breeding their cattle to learn to live more robustly in that part of the earth. And among them grew up a Lutheran community, the Lutheran parish of Linguère in the Lutheran Church of Senegal. And there, I learned from Samba Coulibaly their creation narrative, which was that God first made cows, and then secondly, God made women, and then third and finally, God made men. And the emphasis of that story is on that which gives life, right? Cows. First and foremost, they maintain peace between people groups because their cows are the most important thing, right? Cows first, blood second, religion third, is what they say. They maintain interreligious peace this way. We take care of our cows together. So God made cows first. Then God makes women, of course, life bearers, the Isha. And then finally, God makes men, for whatever reason. Carry things. Very good. Very good. Can you think of those creation narratives from other places and other cultures? I want to point this out because around the world there's often a common thread in creation narratives, and that is that what we see in the phenomenal world, the natural world, is the result of some sort of conflict, some sort of rupture, from which the natural world either falls or carries a piece of divine spark that was shattered. There are many creation myths around the world that begin in conflict. And I want to lift this up because the creation narrative in Genesis, for all that we need to critique and be sharp about, is not a creation narrative about conflict. It's a creation narrative about harmony. Day and night, earth and sea, birds of the air, animals of the field. It's about keeping things in balance. Humans are placed in the garden to tend and to keep that balance, that which was created to be held in harmony. The story of the fall, and I alluded to this yesterday and told you that I'd come back to it. The story of the fall in our creation narrative is a story of disintegration of those relationships. However we interpret the story, of the fall, one thing is for sure, that knowledge of the good and evil turned us in upon ourselves. It's what Luther calls incurvatus in se. That's when we look into ourselves, and I look at myself more than I look at my relationship to you and those growing concentric circles of relationship. And notice that it's at that point, when I focus on myself, that I notice my nakedness. And that's when shame comes into the picture. Shame about myself, rather than focusing on the life-giving value of my relationship to you. And then because of that turning in away from relationship into myself, and that carrying of shame, that rupture of relationship comes ever-increasing disintegration of relationships, right? The human from the other, the Adam from the Ish, the human from the animal. Of course, the human from the divine, and eventually the ultimate rupture, which is we're still dealing with today, the humans from the land itself, the expulsion from the garden, which then becomes that tool of colonialism. Dislocation, disintegration, but the story is of increasing disintegration across those relationships. And that's going to help us today when we think about resurrection as hope for the earth community. And what is it that is bringing hope in this good news for that reconciliation we spoke of yesterday? So again, yesterday we thought more with Kavanaugh about how that Eucharistic remembering, the disintegrated body, thinking from a more human perspective, is the body's political response to the violence of this dismemberment, this disruption and disappearance. It's based on that, just to recall, to bring these things back up, on that notion of anamnesis that's happening in the Eucharist. And there, remember, it's not a remembering, it's not a reenactment. It's a remembering of the body. It's the real presence of being gathered together, and so being embodied in the world. And our gathering, by the way, is a reminder of those who are not there, for whatever reason, for loss, for injustice, for exclusion. And today I want to ask, how does that help with the disintegration of the cosmic body of creation? So specifically, the Eucharistic celebration of Easter, that resurrection good news, which is our every Sunday liturgy, in effect, just in different modes and seasons. The liturgical implications, again, of how remembering ritualizes life after death as hope for the whole earth community. That's where we're going today. So if you want to take off and go to the hot springs, I won't be offended. But I want to begin with sort of an open question. And maybe you can just think about it, but maybe you want to respond. Where are you? Where are you and when are you? How would you answer that question right now? Does anybody want to offer an answer? Here, yes. Magnifique. Here. Where or when is here? It's a question of cosmology. It's a question of space and time. When we talk about our cosmology, where we find ourselves in the world and in relationship, I want to talk here about place and time. Not space, but place. And I want to begin with this image. This is a picture of a parish from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Okay, this is in northern Ethiopia. And I don't know, it's far back, but can you see here in the center? This is the round, this is the church, right? And around it is a forest. And Ethiopian Orthodox have a saying, of course their clergy is all male and they all have beards. They have a saying that a church without a forest is like a priest without a beard. Right? Now, these used to be much larger, these forests. Used to be hundreds or thousands of acres that the church tended and cultivated and owned. And as, of course, pressures have happened, they've shrunk. But the same thing holds, that in the Orthodox Church, Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the temple there is the center of the universe, right? It's the place where God comes and breaks into the world. And this map of the church at the center and the creation all around it is a cosmology, is a whole map of the universe, right? That's reproduced in the architecture and in the place with all creation. I want to show you another picture. This is from Benedicta, do you recognize this? This is from Roskilde Cathedral in Denmark. This is a fresco on the wall. And you may or may not be able to make it out in the image here. I'll talk you through it. What you have is 3 layers. 1, 2, 3. And in this layer, if you could see it very clearly, what you would see is a very Dante-esque picture of hell, right? There's a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth and suffering going on down here. And then do you see this hard line? Very thick hard line that's right here. Okay, here, what you see is a procession of good, faithful people, right? We have some workers. You can make out some different occupations and vocations that are contained here. This is sort of a medieval trope. You see this in a lot of medieval art, this parade of vocations that increasingly, of course, they increase in holiness under the thought of that time until you get to the priest and the good bishops that are here in the front. And there's a table, and on the table is the Eucharist. Above here, do you see now there's a very thin line, a very pale line, and this is the Holy Trinity and the host of angels and all that sat around, like we thought about with that image from Revelation yesterday. Now that thin line comes all the way across, and then it stops right here. And here, from the Eucharist, from the altar, is the crucifix, Christ on the cross. So there's a break in the line right here. And here is that image of the inbreaking of what is above coming down to earth. These images and these architectures in themselves are cosmologies. They're actually patterns, they're maps to help people understand when we come to the table in this place, where we are in the universe. It's a map of time and place. Part of being disconnected from the land and from the earth where we are is this rupture between what we think is going on in terms of this connection between heaven and earth and our connection to the land around us. And yesterday we listed, or thought through, and listed a lot of those sort of narratives about life that the resurrection calls us to resist or equips us to resist. And today I want to focus on one of those, which is resurrection as resisting reductionism. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is the view of time and space that has led to this disintegration, ecological disintegration of what was created to be held in unity. This is what Vitor Vestela called the topological turn. It's a turn in our thinking from a sense of complex space to a focus on simple space and linear time, okay? We're going to get there. We're going to go on a rip here for a little while. Wisdom traditions, including the Hebrew tradition in which our Christian tradition is grounded, viewed life as cycles within a place. Life as cycles within a place. There were seasons, solar, lunar cycles, that lives that went on and died and birthed into each other for generations, 7 generations at a time, all happened within a place as cycles. We can think of it this way. The place in which we live, the actual natural environment, is a place in which all time, all phenomena of life and death, everything happened from generation to generation. It's all happening, cycling in this place. The place holds it. And this place is mysteriously holding this cycle with all that has gone before and all that will be. It becomes a story place, a place that we can go back to where these stories are actually located. But from the Greek philosophical tradition, the Western world took on a new idea. And I want to be careful here because we often throw this term around Western world. I don't think it's particularly helpful. It's too diverse, right? And there are plenty of traditions within the Western world that do not espouse what I'm about to talk about. So I want to be specific here. It's those ways of thought that inherited sort of a Greek foundation of thinking about time and space. In those traditions, there came this genealogy through this Catholic scholasticism that resulted in nominalism, which turned into a strain of Protestantism that led to the scientific revolution, and that included a group of people, a puritanical strain, that settled here on Turtle Island and stamped that influence on American culture. I'll let the Canadians speak for yourself. But I want to pause there for just a second and say that in the middle there is this idea of nominalism. This is just something to jot down and take a look at later. But just quickly to say, this was a sort of idea that really equipped the scientific revolution. It was this idea that moved from this understanding of our place as being full of spirit, full of the presence of life, of God, to this idea of the distance of God, okay? So God is distant, and we are separate from God, and God only relates to us now in terms of command or will or covenant. Right? There's a whole process here that I would encourage you to take a look at. But today, I just want to note that this is part of our tradition that includes settler theology, which Willie Jennings has focused on this disconnection from the land as one of the marks of this sort of settler and white theology. All of that is possible because it interprets our physical and natural place as mere phenomenal space. It's just a space in which our life unfolds in a linear fashion. So as a consequence, theology focused more in that period of time. It started to focus more on questions about the substance of God, rather than the mystery that everything that is subsists in God. And natural philosophy at that time, or a couple centuries later, which becomes what we know as life sciences and earth sciences, becomes detached from that metaphysical reality. All of the life cycles that we're studying unfold within a creative energy that sustains a soulful earth community as one, with its own agency to create and sustain, that is more than the sum of its parts. This transformed in North Atlantic cultures, transformed the earth from a soulful, complex space to simple space. And one way to think about this transition from complex place to simple space is the move from geometry to mathematics. All right, don't glaze over on me. Oh yeah, what, say again? Excellent. See, this is why I did this, because some of you in here, this is gonna land. I hope it lands for everyone, okay? But go with me here. The move from geometry to mathematics, to computation, algebra. Because before the scientific revolution led to the industrial revolution, the consequences of which we're dealing with today, there was a revolution in mathematics that was occurring at the beginning of the Renaissance. And it was a mathematical shift from geometry to algebra. And here's the point. Geometry is spatial, Okay, geometry thinks about the space that we're in. It's here and now. It's a measure of the way that everything sort of unfolds and the patterns that we see and how they connect in this space. Think of the cycles of nature and ancestors I talked about before, the communion of saints intertwining, cycling within this space, all happening. This is Pythagoras, right? This understanding of complex space. This is also, by the way, where Augustine bases his whole theory of music, the harmony and the way that things fit together are an image of God's beauty, right? It's a reflection of creation, the harmony, and what gives life and peace in this world. We can extend that to ecologies of biodiversity, not only sung harmony, but lived harmony that creates life. This is people like Nicholas of Cusa, where his whole idea about God is one whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. This is Julian of Norwich, who sees the whole cosmos reproduced in the microcosm of a hazelnut. This is geometry lived, if not practiced mathematically. But when you have a shift to modeling or understanding how forces will work out so that we can predict them, you have to move to a more algebraic formula that can be tested and tried and underwrite our experiments. And this is the context in which the algebra that came to this part of the world, or let's say North Atlantic during the Renaissance, gave birth to the scientific revolution. This leads right to Newton's laws and of the universe, right? Yes, the mechanistic worldview. We need to have equations to see how things are gonna, if I push here, what's gonna happen, right? This algebraic move, this move from geometry to algebra, actually created the need for new numbers. Okay, go with me here, because you might be thinking, yes, what do you mean new numbers? Numbers just are, right? This is how colonized we are to think about numbers. In fact, numbers are a result of very cultural ways of thinking, or the kinds of questions that we're actually asking about our surroundings and our relationship to the world around us. So if I ask you to start counting, right, if we're going to break into small groups, which we're not, but if we are, and we're going to start counting, how do you start counting? Right. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the first number, right? We start with 1. Well, if I click through here, 0, the concept was actually invented. It was first probably in the 5th century CE by a Hindu philosopher, Aryabhata. But in Persia, it came into the Islamic world, the concept of 0, around the 9th century. It's Khwarizmi, which becomes the word algorithm, by the way. This is where we get the word algorithm. Wrote about this, who influenced Fibonacci in Europe in the 13th century. Okay, so Fibonacci starts counting with 0, right? This is new. It seems like it's always been there. This had to be thought of and introduced because we could imagine nothing, and we have to deal with that, okay? I want to lift this up because George Tinker, one of the teachers and philosophers who is Osage, Native American, has taught us that among the Osage people, there of course is no concept of 0, because in my relationship to creation around me, I can't conceive of nothing. But in the Osage Nation, they have no word for the number 1. Why? There is no 1. There's always 2. You start with 2 because there has to be a relationship for anything that we're going to do in our life. And I want to lift that up because the idea of the Holy Three is a concept about relationality in place. Complex relationships need to be there for the unity and life to be creative. But that nominalist and scientific revolution led to the flattening of space. That flattening of space, until later Einstein comes along, right, and says, well, not so fast, because at a larger cosmic scale, these relationships behave differently. Newton's worldview doesn't quite function on all levels. Time bends, space bends, according to this scale of matter and relationships. Okay, that's complicated enough. And then quantum physics comes along and they say, okay, Einstein's looking at the big picture, but let's look at the tiny picture, and the same thing happens. None of this behaves like we think it is when we get down to the quantum level. Exactly, the butterfly effect. That's right. And to lean into Tinker again, when we look at our wisdom traditions, friends, we discover that we already know this. This is anamnesis. This is remembering what we've always known. We are star people. From dust we come, and to dust we shall return. And in the meantime, we're all participating. We know this, or we knew this. And maybe we didn't know how, but in our creation narratives, they remind us of why. And now we know the how. We, people of faith, knowledge bearers, storytellers, we have to remind ourselves and one another of the why. And that means retracing our steps through our tradition. New kinds of communities, telling ourselves these new stories, re-narrating, creating geographies of relationships, ecological, biological, social, that subsist in the spirit, that become vessels for what Hildegard called the greenness, that is that spirit of love that's shot through all creation, that revives and sustains. And so I want to think then about time, because part of that turn, that topological turn that transformed the Earth community from a soulful, complex space to this simple space, was about this perception of the advance of time and progress. It imagines the Earth as, if you can think about it, as just maybe a beaker in which things happen, but the beaker is not affected. The whole of our life and history just marches on. There are many ways to talk about the effects of this way of thinking. Certainly, we can think about the demystification of nature, as Max Weber says, or what Carolyn Merchant calls the death of nature, which I'd encourage you to write that down, because her look at it is fascinating, about the genealogy between the ideas of Francis Bacon and mining and the medicalization of birth and women's health that mirrored this sort of hegemonic masculinity of exploration that of course results in colonialism and extractionism. But all of these ways of thinking left its mark on our perspective of time itself. You know, in the story I've been telling, that I served on the continent of Africa for a lot of years, and the first time I went, I stepped off the bus to meet one of our guides in South Africa. And he said, "Welcome to Africa. In Europe, you have watches. In Africa, we have time." Many North American or North Atlantic cultures developed a focus on this idea of history or the trajectory of life as one that just progresses through time in a place, doesn't matter where. Time keeps going. That view of history left us to this idea of progress. We leave things behind and we move together towards some other future. Normally, we like to think that's better, and we call it progress. And you can see how this would affect our interpretation of the resurrection, of life after death. That soteriological focus is now on what concerns the afterlife. The ultimate aim of the Christ event becomes some point in history far away where we humans will be saved to, or saved for. That great by and by, where we will all fly away. And that eschatological future is the one into which we're leaning. And therefore, works righteousness, that idea comes around to make sure that you better get working if you want to get there someday, right? Progress, works righteousness. We dealt with that as Lutherans, but not so much with the Protestant work ethic that lingered in its wake. Now, I want to say here that Luther is so much a part of the West. Luther is so much a part of this tradition, but he is no nominalist. I stand by that, and I've been found in a few debates about it. But I want to say he's no nominalist. He is positively medieval in many ways, and his experience of this world around us as complex space is something that's so familiar to his worldview. It shapes his whole understanding of sacramental theology and how the entirety of creation subsists in God, and the gospel is proclaimed in trees and creation around us. He quotes Nicholas of Cusa that I referred to earlier. This sacramental view of the world, of where the finite can contain the infinite, is the grounds for this complex view of time known as prolepsis, the inbreaking of the kingdom. If we go back to that fresco from Denmark. This is like the indigenous cycles of time that happen here, that cycle within a place that's holy. Specifically, God's initiative for the gift and promise of a reconciled cosmos to be revealed and to be continued and participated through the sacraments. And in Luther's catechism, he says, "Your kingdom come in me," right, is not a prayer that the kingdom will come, because that's God's business. It's coming. But that it would happen in me, that I would participate in it today, right here from this table. Your kingdom come. And we think yesterday about that sanctus, being able to join in that place and time of inbreaking. So this calls into question that whole idea that was brought up in the Q&A yesterday about eschatology, time and future, thinking of resurrection as new life for all creation here and now. And this is where we return to where I pointed us yesterday, that the resurrection, the good news of the resurrection, helps us to resist those narratives or perspectives that lead to these forces that disintegrate ecologies, and I hope build anticipatory communities that participate in life after death for all creation. We can think here of the song of the angels at Christ's birth, right? Glory to God in the highest, and peace, we usually say, to all people on earth. The Greek is pretty clear there. Peace in the soil, in the dirt, is actually what it says, in the earth. And then, of course, in the year of Mark, Christ's command to go and proclaim this good news to all creation. Good news for all creation. This affects our charismatic ministry, the way we preach and proclaim. It's part of our ministerial call in word and sacrament. But also it's a theological commitment about the work of the Trinity and a witness to the ubiquity of Christ. Joseph Sittler in 1961 gave an address to the WCC Assembly in New Delhi that was entitled Called to Unity. But he pushed that idea of unity beyond ecumenism in the church. And he premised his eco-theological approach on the first chapter of Colossians, the reconciliation ta panta of all creation. And Sittler reminds us that Christ is not only the matrix and the prius of creation, the Trinity that creates itself, but the reconciliation of all, as I said yesterday, as part of that ministry entrusted to the church. So it's not only in our preaching, but sacramental, in the sense that all creation exists in God, subsists in God. This is part of the reason, by the way, that in the flood prayer for baptism, Luther does not only pray for the water that we use in this font, but it's a word of thanksgiving for the waters, for all waters. And of course, in the Eucharist, in the Sanctus, all creation participating. That can help us reconsider the scope and the cycles of nature that are around us. And it can also help reorient our species, ourselves as a species in the world. But so too can reconsidering the importance of liturgy itself. And so here I want to take a little run through some liturgical pieces to see how this can help us. Because Christianity, at its heart, is, I would argue, it's about cosmology. It's about reorient us in these relationships. And Matthew Fox has identified how the word spirituality was never actually used before the Reformation. And I want you to read there, Scientific Revolution, right? The word spirituality was never used in Aquinas, for example, because cosmology was the whole project. It was only when we created this flat sense of space and time that we needed to speak about spirituality that would somehow recover this understanding and experience of the Spirit of God at work in the world. So liturgy, of course, helps us with that, and helps us to create those cosmologies. There are, first of all, different ways of measuring time, right? We know this. We can think about planetary time. Think about the cycles of solar and lunar cycles that are around us. Of course, there's Chronos, that the watches that our African friends and friends from Latin America and the Caribbean remind us is only one way to measure time. And of course, there's divine time, Kairos, that inbreaking of the kingdom, the communion of saints, and that cycling through the generations. And there are a couple significant worship guides, let's say, within the liturgy that help us to reorient ourselves as human beings in the world to different senses and understanding of time. And one is the liturgical year. And before I mention that specifically, I want to just remind us that this is something that's been known, that this religious impulse in people for all time. We see in the stone hinges around the world, and we see in the ways that Native Americans measure time relative to sun and moon, that these worship spaces, whatever they were, and there's a lot of theories, but what they're doing is mapping the universe for us, grounding us in a new sense of a cycle of time that relates us to this place. And it's not unlike the liturgical year. The liturgical year that brings us through this cycle relates to the seasons that are around us. You know the only day in the liturgical year that's grounded, that's set? You know which one that is? It's Christmas. That's the only one that's set on the solstice, basically, roughly, on a solstice. Everything else revolves, changes with the cycles of the sun and the moon. But if we think about liturgy, it helps us reorient again, not this linear progression until the end of time, but cycling through the story of faith and generations within our place. The liturgical year, which of course is different than the calendar year, which is another help. We celebrate New Year in Advent, helps reorient our people in a different sense of time. Of course, the texts themselves do this. They walk us through retelling the story. Again, think of Emily Towns and re-narrating. How do we resist? We re-story, we re-proclaim this sense of time and retell ourselves. This gets us closer to this sense, too, of what we know from our indigenous friends who think about walkabout, finding the stories in our place. How do these stories unfold across generations? And in a sense, we, when we're proclaiming in our ministry of word, are doing the same. But I also want to think then about the space for worship and how that helps us. Because thinking back now to the Orthodox example, the temple in Jerusalem was the same. It was a cosmology. And of course, this was based at the time on a map of purity, right? Where the Holy of Holies was at the center of the universe. Think again of that image of the Orthodox Church. This is where God broke through in time and space. And then, according to our purity, different ones of us could approach closer or farther from that place of inbreaking. It was in itself a cosmology of the way they understood right relationships in the world at the time. With the advent of house churches, where we would gather early Christians to celebrate this meal, that was intentionally reoriented because we moved from that purity map to a mercy map, geographies of grace and spaces of grace. They tended to be more communal and in the round, as was practiced where we gathered for sharing of life and the meal at that time. Of course, when this gets mapped onto other ideas about power and hierarchy in the world, thinking now of Constantinian Christianity, we return to the basilica model, which is actually a map that mirrored that basilica model where the emperor sat, where the table would be, and the relics got put into that spot, transferring that power and sense of holiness of the emperor to the relics themselves. And of course, we had a little thing called the Reformation to help us with some of those ways of thinking. But practically, we were left with this architectural model of churches, which still dictates people's experience of space. But I want to say that all is not lost, because I want to point us to Gothic cosmology. Because Gothic, whatever it is, and it's beautiful and it's wonderful, what it did was to actually, in pre-literate times, help people through story and architecture and art to get this sense of cosmology when they walked in the door. And this is Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. If you haven't been there, I hope you do, because it's the best example of Gothic architecture and what I'm going to talk about here that we have in the world today. At the top are always, it's painted blue with stars, right? And then as you descend, and this is part of the engineering miracle that they were able to create this sort of ethereal sense out of stone, you descend through these stained glass rounds, which is always stories from the Bible and images of the saints that have gone before. This is the heavenly host gathered, of course, and the place where the table is usually surrounded by angels. It's that image from Revelation. And then you descend down to the floor, and in the floor or in the walls are always going to be these images. Usually on the pillars, this is where we get images of, let's say, the Green Man, right? Nature comes into view, and by the time we get to the floor, there's going to be images of all creation. There's going to be images of the built environment. You see churches and buildings, images of rivers. And so here, when you take all of this together, you're walking into a space where even if you can't read the stories, and even if you can't understand the Latin that was being spoken at you, you got this experience of a new cosmology. And the reason that this is important here is because creation within this experience of worship, it's clear that creation is part of God's story, of how we're created from love and how we're reconciled to love. And so every creature's story becomes of being, their being and becoming has to become part of our story too. And like we discussed in the Q&A yesterday, that being and the becoming involves all creation, not just humanity. In this way, our public liturgical counter-remembering through what we do in our liturgy and what we say in our proclamation can become an act of resistance that strengthens our Christian witness to God as creator and our faith in what God is doing in Christ to reconcile all creation as agents of this transformation. And so I want to end here by thinking about how our liturgy becomes not only public space in terms of our liturgy, our worship in creation and with all creation, but how it becomes the space for all creation to participate in the table around us. In other words, it's another way of helping the church see as our worshiping community that we have a role in public space, but also sees our worship as public space where all creation can come and participate. What this does is to also help us in our liturgy to remind us, again, what we pointed at yesterday in the Q&A, that part of our becoming and part of what is being reconciled is our human vocation to return, as the second creation narrative in Genesis says, to those two fundamental words, abad and shamar, to till and to keep, to help us reorient ourselves in our role within the garden. So Christian worship and liturgy are particularly suited to provide us with opportunities for practically promoting this sort of ecological formation, for pointing us back through the meal to these relationships. And rooted in our theology of the Spirit and diverse traditions of spiritual theology, worship provides us with a location for witness to that resurrection as resistance to reductionism, and the moral imagination for new and complex space. And I want to say that in our age of climate change, there is enough fear and trembling that can sometimes cause a lot of that paralysis from eco-anxiety that we spoke about yesterday. And by promoting worship and liturgy as a location for parishioners to encounter the Holy Spirit in communion with other non-human members of our local ecology, churches can provide that ecologically shaped and rooted context where our ecological vocation can be received and heard as a gift and a promise, a living out of this good news of resurrection that we receive. And so when we gather in the context of our local ecology, let's say to proclaim the good news to all creation, then administer the sacraments, and this creation becomes not just space, but a theater of love with every creature. We really are offering a hermeneutic of hope for the whole earth community in our preaching and in our sacraments. I want to say in this way, the resurrection then becomes as much about a doctrine of creation as it does a doctrine of salvation. And it was Karl Rahner that reminded us that any soteriology that's thinking about salvation and what Christ is doing, that only stops and is aimed at the salvation of human souls, is a weak Christology in the face of a Christ who we claim is cosmic pancreator, part of the Trinity that creates, sustains, and redeems. And so I want to stop here with just a couple of examples or stories about the way that we can create this complex space, or that I've seen it done. First of all, I want to just commend to you the Season of Creation, which is an ecumenical group which the Lutheran World Federation, we participate in, along with our Anglican colleagues, lots of agencies that are engaged in creation care and climate justice, and the ecology sector of the Vatican Dicastery for promoting integral human development. And in the content of ecumenical dialogue, these are resources that we produce every year that are celebrated between September 1st, which is the Orthodox prayer for creation, and October 4th, which was traditionally the feast day of St. Francis. And that provides us with a set of liturgies there to join in prayer and action as the whole ecumenical family. There are, of course, myriad of online devotions to help us with preaching, to help us with teaching. There are so many that are produced, in-house and by you within the Lutheran Church in Canada and all of our friends around the communion. Lutherans Restoring Creation, Sustainable Preaching, Green Anglicans, all a host of liturgical resources that we can use to do this. But also think of this way, that every Eucharist involves bread and wine. They can be locally sourced. They can be locally made. Every Easter Vigil, we light a new fire. And we can think of having these experiences out in our local ecology so that people can reorient themselves and get to know the place in which our worship unfolds, in which Christ breaks in through the sacrament and preaching. The example that I want to share is Bishop Sho of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Tanzania, who has asked that for every baptism, the family plant at least one tree. And of course, there's the connection with new life. There's the connection with even the waters that water the tree, but also as we walk wet in the promises of our baptism. And in this way, every member of the church knows and practices the fact that their local ecology shares in this life-giving, renewing, and transforming hope that we are proclaiming. Now, the last story that I want to tell is from the parish St. Columba's by the Castle, which is a Scottish Episcopal church in Edinburgh, Scotland. where I did my doctoral studies. And there I was blessed to serve on the clergy team while I was doing my studies. And they were in a pastoral transition. And so there was a time of study where the whole congregation, including the children, did their congregational profile in order to call a pastor. And in that gap, they asked if I would participate as part of the clergy team to, fill in and administer and preach. Of course I would. And so I was assigned, my first Sunday was actually Easter. During those weeks, there was a man there in the congregation. His name was Matthew, and he was experiencing homelessness. He was a shepherd from the highlands and had made his way to the city and became part of the congregation through the ministry with people experiencing homelessness there in Edinburgh. So Matthew came faithfully every Sunday, and with Matthew came his dog Patch, his sheepdog. He sat in the back of the church for a lot of weeks, and eventually we convinced him to come up, friend, and Patch is welcome. And he started to come and sit on the front row every day, and eventually we convinced him to become one of the worship assistants. And in that parish, as a way to embody this less basilica model of space and more of the house church model that I was talking about, one thing that they did was the assistants brought forward the elements and would join the priest behind the altar and then stand in a circle, those that were helping. So it was a way of trying to close the circle, around the table, because the architecture made it impossible to bring the table out. And so that Sunday on Easter, I was presiding. And at the time of the offertory, here comes the elements. And Matthew comes, and he brings the bread, and hands it to me, and takes his place beside me. And of course, Patch had come with him and sat there at the corner of the altar. And so there, at that moment, when I read the words of institution and the Eucharistic prayer, we celebrated the fact that here we were singing, again, with all the saints, the host of heaven, and all creation, and there sat Patch. A couple months later, the church finished their congregational profile. They were ready for the call process. And what they did, which was beautiful, was include the analysis of the congregation, but they began every section with a quote from the children. They asked the children all the same questions, heard what they said, and included it in the papers. And then for the section that introduced the congregation, who are we? The adults did an amazing job to do all of the sort of demographics and all of the analysis on who we were. The children said this: we are a lot of loving people and one dog. We're creating new cosmologies. So to conclude, Easter and the resurrection as we proclaim it and experience it through the theodrama of every liturgy when we gather is an opportunity to resist all those political, social, economic, and scientific discourses that would disintegrate creation and proclaim the good news of the reconciliation of all the cosmos that transforms our congregations into anticipatory communities. And it holds the possibility of reconciling all the baptized to our original human vocation, till and keep the garden as part of this ministry of reconciliation that has been entrusted to the church in ways that transform our parishes into complex geographies of grace that embody hope for the entire earth community. And friends, I thank you for this time, and that's my prayer for all of us here this Easter and beyond. Thank you.